The stagecoach groaned to a halt in a cloud of alkali dust that tasted of grit and endings. For the other passengers, it was just another stop, a place to stretch legs, get a lukewarm whiskey, and complain about the godforsaken heat. For the girl who stepped down last, it was the edge of the world. She clutched a small, worn carpet bag to her chest, its faded floral pattern a ghost of some gentler place. Her dress, a simple gray calico, was caked with the dust of 1,000 miles, the hem frayed from hurried steps on rough ground. She kept her eyes fixed on the splintered planks of the boardwalk, her bonnet drawn low to hide a face that felt too pale, too young for the hard set of her mouth. This was Raven's Rest, the name, heard in a hushed conversation between two travelers weeks ago, had stuck in her mind like a burr, a place to rest, a place dark enough to hide. It was little more than a single dusty street flanked by a dozen sun-bleached buildings, a general store, a saloon with a busted-out window, a livery stable that smelled of horse sweat and hay, and a handful of other structures leaning against each other as if for support. The wind, coming off the high plains, carried the scent of pine and something else, something wild and lonely that settled deep in her lungs. She was Hattie Miles. She repeated the name in her head, a silent prayer. It felt foreign on her tongue, a garment she was trying on for the first time. It had been her mother's name, before marriage had taken it and a fever had taken her life. It was the only thing Hattie had deliberately stolen when she'd run. Everything else, the fine clothes, the heavy silverware, the suffocating house she had left behind. They belonged to Hattie Albright, and Hattie Albright had ceased to exist 3 nights ago in the dark. Just a month prior, she hadn't been Hattie Miles. She had been Hattie Gable, daughter of a man whose charm was as thin as his wallet. Her father had a gentleman's taste for good whiskey and bad cards, a combination that had finally led him to a debt he couldn't talk his way out of. The solution, presented to her in the stifling parlor of their rented rooms back east, was a man named Silas Albright. He's a man of considerable means. Hattie, her father had said, avoiding her gaze by polishing his spectacles with a stained handkerchief. He's taken a liking to you. It would be a most advantageous match for the family. Hattie knew what family meant. It meant him. Silas Albright was twice her age, a man whose wealth was so old it had grown cold and hard like stone. He was soft in the body but sharp in the eyes. And when he looked at her, it was not with affection, but with the quiet, calculating gaze of a man assessing livestock. He never asked her questions about her dreams or her thoughts. He simply observed her posture, the quality of her skin, the gentle curve of her neck. He was purchasing a wife, and her father was the desperate merchant. She had protested, of course, quietly at first, then with a tearful plea that earned her a look of tired impatience. "There is no other way," her father had said, his voice flat. "The arrangements have been made." The wedding was a small, airless affair. She felt like a doll dressed in borrowed lace, her hand limp and cold in Silas Albright's fleshy grip. She said the words that were required of her, her voice a whisper that was swallowed by the cavernous church. The whole time, she felt a profound sense of detachment, as if she were watching another girl, someone foolish and doomed, standing at the altar. Then came the night, her wedding night, her first night. She had been raised to believe that this was a sacred, if mysterious, duty, a wife's obligation. Her mother, in the vague, hushed tones of the time, had once spoken of it as a joining, a quiet intimacy shared between two people who cared for one another. There was no joining with Silas Albright. He did not speak to her as he locked the bedroom door. The sound of the key turning in the lock was the loudest thing she had ever heard. He moved with a sense of methodical purpose, as if he were merely completing the final step of a business transaction. He expected compliance, and her fear, her frozen stillness, was taken as such. It was not a passionate assault, which in some ways might have been easier to understand. There was no fire in him, There was only the cold, methodical claiming of a debt her father had incurred and she was meant to pay. She retreated to a place deep inside herself, a small, quiet room in her mind where the scent of his bay rum and the weight of his body couldn't reach. She focused on a crack in the plaster ceiling, tracing its path with her eyes until it became a river on a map, a river leading anywhere but here. Her body became a thing apart from her, a vessel enduring a storm while she, the passenger, hid below deck. It was a quiet, clinical process of ownership, and when it was over, he simply rolled away from her and began to snore, leaving her to lie in the wreckage. That was the night she wanted to forget, the night she knew she never would. It hadn't just been her body that had been trespassed upon. It was her very sense of self. She was no longer her own. She was an asset, a piece of property. For 3 days, she moved through his grand, silent house like a ghost. She ate the food prepared by a silent cook, wore the clothes laid out by a silent maid, and endured the polite, possessive hand of her husband at her elbow during dinner. She said nothing. Her silence was a wall she was building, brick by painful brick. On the 3rd night, something inside her broke. Or perhaps it was mended just enough to act. She waited until the house was still, until her husband's snores were a deep and steady rhythm from the master bedroom. She slipped out of bed, her bare feet silent on the cold wood floors. She did not take the pearls he had given her, nor the silk dresses hanging in the wardrobe. She took a single, sturdy traveling dress, her worn boots, and the small amount of cash she had saved from her meager allowance over the years. Before she left, she stood before the hallway mirror. The face that stared back was a stranger's pale, with dark, hollowed eyes. Hattie Albright. The name tasted like ash in her mouth. She would not carry it. She would not be the final payment on her father's gambling debt. She reached into the bottom of her satchel, past the extra pair of stockings and the half-eaten apple, and pulled out a small, tarnished silver locket. It had been her mother's. Inside, there was no picture, only the faint, looping initials, E.M., Elizabeth Miles, ** Miles, **. The name was a shield. It was an anchor. It was the only thing of value she carried with her. She left the house, a shadow slipping into the pre-dawn gray, and never looked back. She walked until her feet bled, then used her money to buy a ticket on the first westbound coach she could find, and then another, and another, pushing deeper into the continent, away from the life that had been chosen for her. And now, she stood here, in Raven's Rest, the dust of that escape still clinging to her clothes. A man leaning against a post outside the saloon tipped his hat, his eyes lingering on her for a moment too long. Hattie flinched, pulling her bag closer, her knuckles white. She was no longer an object to be bought, but she felt fragile, breakable, a thing to be taken. Every glance from a man felt like a threat, every shadow a memory. She took a deep, shuddering breath of the dry, pine-scented air. She had no plan, no money to speak of, no one to turn to. All she had was a borrowed name and a past she was desperate to outrun. But as she took her first step onto the dusty main street of Raven's Rest, one thing was certain. She had survived, and for now, that would have to be enough. The first night in Raven's Rest, Hattie slept in the shadow of the livery stable, curled into a ball with her carpetbag for a pillow. The ground was cold and unyielding, and the unfamiliar night sounds the hoot of an owl, the distant yip of a coyote. The drunken shouting from the saloon kept her suspended in a state of shallow, fitful sleep. Every snapping twig, every gust of wind was a footstep in the dark, and she would start awake, her heart hammering against her ribs, the scent of bay rum phantom in the air. By dawn, her body was a knot of aches and exhaustion, but she was unseen, and that was a victory. She spent the day walking the edges of the town, observing. Raven's Rest was a place of harsh sunlight and deep shadows. Men with sun-creased faces and calloused hands moved with a purpose she envied. Women in faded gingham dresses hurried between the general store and their modest homes, their expressions a mixture of weariness and resilience. No one paid her much mind. A lone woman in a dusty dress was a common enough sight in the West. A preacher's daughter heading to a new post, a mail-order bride who'd lost her nerve, or someone simply running from a past best left unexamined. Hattie was grateful for the anonymity. But anonymity didn't fill a stomach, and the last of her coins went to a loaf of stale bread and a piece of hard cheese. By the second evening, a gnawing panic began to set in. She couldn't sleep by the livery forever. She needed work, a roof, a place where she could lock a door. Her wanderings led her to the far end of the street, past the blacksmith's forge where the rhythmic clang of a hammer rang out, to a small, tidy house set back from the road. A picket fence, in desperate need of whitewash, enclosed a chaotic but vibrant garden of herbs and wildflowers. A hand-painted sign hanging crookedly from the gate read, "Odelia Finch, Tinctures, Tonics, and Mending." Hattie hesitated, her hand hovering over the latch. The house seemed quiet, private. Taking a deep breath, she pushed the gate open. It squealed in protest. Immediately, a woman emerged from behind the house, wiping her hands on a large apron. She was older, with a cloud of wiry gray hair escaping a loose bun and a face as wrinkled and intricate as a dried apple. Her eyes, however, were a startlingly bright blue, sharp and missing nothing. "Well now," the woman said, her voice raspy like dry leaves. "The gate doesn't get many visitors who don't have a fever or a torn shirt. What's your trouble, child?" Hattie's own voice came out as a croak. "I'm looking for work, ma'am, any kind of work." "Mrs." Odelia Finch looked her up and down, a long, assessing gaze that made Hattie feel as transparent as glass. It wasn't a cruel look, just thorough. "You're not from around here, running from something." "I'd wager. Most everyone is, one way or another." Hattie flinched, pulling her shawl tighter. I'm just passing through. I can cook, clean, mend. I'm a hard worker." "Mrs." Finch grunted, turning her attention to a stubborn weed by the porch steps. "Don't have need of a cook or a cleaner. I manage my own house, and I do my own mending, as the sign says." Hattie's shoulders slumped. Disappointment, cold and sharp, pierced through her. Of course, it had been a foolish hope. She was about to turn and leave when the old woman spoke again. "But the barn needs mucking out, and the roof leaks in the north corner, and I suppose I could use a hand turning the soil in the garden before the first frost." She squinted at Hattie again. "You look like a strong wind could knock you over. Have you eaten?" Hattie could only shake her head, ashamed of the tears that pricked her eyes. "Thought so, Mrs." Finch said briskly. "Come inside. We'll talk over a bowl of stew. Work is work, but a body can't do it on an empty stomach." The inside of the cottage was cluttered but clean, smelling of dried lavender and cinnamon. A pot of thick beef stew bubbled on the stove, and Hattie's stomach clenched with a hunger so intense it was painful. "Mrs." Finch ladled a generous portion into a bowl and set it on the small kitchen table without ceremony. Hattie ate, forcing herself to go slowly, not to devour the food like a starving animal. It was the first warm meal she'd had in weeks. The arrangement was simple. Hattie could have the small room in the loft of the barn in exchange for her labor. It wasn't a room so much as a space partitioned off, but it had a cot, a thick blanket, and, most importantly, a heavy wooden door with a sturdy iron bolt on the inside. That first night, after mucking the stalls until her back screamed and her hands were raw, Hattie slid the bolt home. The sound, a solid, definitive asterisk thunk asterisk, was the most comforting thing she had ever heard. In the quiet dark, surrounded by the warm, living scent of hay and horse, she finally slept without dreaming. Her life fell into a quiet, repetitive rhythm. She rose with the sun, tended to Mrs. Finch's 2 chickens and ornery goat, worked in the garden, and patched the barn roof with tar and old shingles. She spoke little, and Mrs. Finch, to her immense relief, didn't press her for conversation. The old woman seemed to understand that Hattie's silence was a fragile shield. But the world outside the small sanctuary of Mrs. Finch's property was a constant threat. Her past was a stain, invisible to others but a burning mark on her own soul. This became devastatingly clear in her interactions, or her avoidance of them. One afternoon, Mrs. Finch reached out to brush a piece of straw from Hattie's hair. It was a simple, motherly gesture, but Hattie reacted without thinking. She jerked back so violently she stumbled, her breath catching in her throat, her eyes wide with a terror that was entirely out of proportion to the act. Mrs. Finch froze, her hand still in the air. She didn't look offended, only a deep, sad understanding dawning in her bright blue eyes. She slowly lowered her hand. "The chickens need feeding," she said softly, turning away and giving Hattie the space to collect herself. The moment passed, unspoken, but it left a chasm between them. Hattie learned to keep a careful distance, to angle her body away, to anticipate any potential touch and preempt it. She was an island, and she would not allow anyone to make landfall. Her defensiveness was a constant, low hum beneath the surface of her quiet existence. When she had to go to the general store for supplies, she would walk with her head down, her gaze fixed on the ground ahead, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. She felt the eyes of the townsmen on her, and every look felt like a violation, an appraisal. One evening, Mrs. Finch sent her to fetch a sack of flour just as the sun was setting. The light, golden and long, cast deep shadows across the street. The saloon doors were thrown open, spilling yellow light and the raucous sound of laughter and a badly played piano onto the boardwalk. As Hattie approached the general store next door, a group of men stumbled out of the saloon, reeking of whiskey and cheap cigars. She tried to make herself smaller, to slip past them unnoticed, but one of them, a burly man with a thick beard, caught sight of her. "Well, look what we have here," he slurred, his voice loud enough to carry a pretty little sparrow, all alone. His companion snickered. "Careful. Jed, she looks like she'd bite." "I like a little bite." The first man, Jed, shot back with a leering grin. The other men laughed, a coarse, ugly sound that scraped against Hattie's raw nerves. They weren't speaking directly to her, not yet, but their words were aimed at her like stones. She froze, her hand on the door to the store, her knuckles white. The laughter, the casual way they spoke of a woman as something to be caught, to be conquered. It was the sound from her wedding night, the sound of a world where she had no say, where her body was a subject for public comment, for sport. Her breath hitched. The street seemed to narrow, the sounds of the town fading to a dull roar in her ears. All she could hear was their voices, their laughter. All she could feel was the memory of a heavy weight, of a cold finality. She felt a profound and terrifying shrinking inside her own skin, a coiling inward like a snail retreating into its shell. She was no longer a woman standing on a street. She was a small, cornered thing, prey that had been spotted. Her only instinct was to disappear, to become so small and still that the predators would lose interest and pass her by. She stood there, paralyzed, her gaze locked on a loose nail in the boardwalk, praying for them to move on, praying for the world to simply swallow her whole. The laughter of the men on the boardwalk was a physical force, pressing in on Hattie until she couldn't draw a full breath. Her vision tunneled, the world shrinking to the splintered wood at her feet. She was trapped, a rabbit frozen in the path of a snake, and the memory of a locked door and a silent, methodical violation threatened to pull her under. Just as the man named Jed took a step toward her, the door of the general store creaked open. A stout, balding man in a flour-dusted apron appeared, a broom in his hand. He was Mr. Henderson, the proprietor, and his face was set in a permanent scowl. "That's enough, you lot!" he barked, his voice surprisingly loud. "Take your caterwauling back to the saloon where it belongs. You're frightening my customers." Jed stopped, blinking stupidly. "We ain't doing nothing." "Henderson, you're doing it on my boardwalk. Now move along before I fetch the sheriff to help you." Grumbling, the men shuffled away, their drunken bravado deflating under the storekeeper's glare. The sudden quiet they left behind was as jarring as the noise had been. "Mr." Henderson looked at Hattie, his expression softening slightly. "You all right, miss?" Hattie couldn't form words. She managed a single, jerky nod and pushed past him into the store, desperate to escape the open street. The interior of the store was a sanctuary of shadows and smells. The air was thick with the mingled scents of coffee beans, cured leather, molasses, and dust. Sacks of flour and sugar were stacked high against one wall. Barrels of pickles and crackers stood in a line, and shelves were crammed with everything from cast-iron skillets to bolts of calico fabric. For a moment, the sheer ordinariness of it all calmed the frantic beating of her heart. Then she saw him. He was standing at the far end of the counter, his back mostly to her. He was a tall man, built on a scale that seemed too large for the cramped space. His shoulders, broad and powerful under a simple chambray shirt, strained the seams. His hair was the color of dark wheat, bleached by the sun, and the skin on his neck and hands was a deep, weathered brown. He was examining the handle of a new axe, turning it over in his hands with a slow, deliberate motion. Even from across the room, she could see that his hands were huge, the knuckles scarred, the fingers long and capable. He was the kind of man whose sheer size was a statement, a physical fact that could not be ignored. Hattie immediately tensed. He was nothing like the soft, fleshy Silas Albright, nor the boisterous drunks from the saloon. But he was a man, and he was large, and that was enough to set every nerve on edge. She tried to make herself invisible, keeping to the far side of the store as she gathered the few items misses. Finch had requested flour, salt, a spool of black thread. She kept him in the corner of her eye. Unlike the other men in town, he wasn't watching her. He seemed completely absorbed in his task, his focus narrowed to the grain of the wood in his hands. There was a stillness about him, a quiet economy of motion that was the exact opposite of the loud, restless energy of the saloon crowd. He smelled faintly of pine sap and sawdust, a clean, sharp scent that cut through the store's musty air. After a moment, he placed the axe on the counter. His decision apparently made, he exchanged a few quiet words with Mr. Henderson, his voice a low rumble that Hattie couldn't quite make out. He paid for his goods, which included the axe, a side of bacon, and a large sack of coffee beans. He moved with an unhurried grace that seemed at odds with his size, and as he turned to leave, his path briefly intersected with hers at the main counter. His eyes met hers for a single, fleeting second. They were a clear, startling gray, the color of a winter sky over the mountains, and they were framed by lines etched by sun and wind. There was no appraisal in his gaze, no curiosity, nothing but a simple, neutral acknowledgement of her presence. Still, it was enough to make her heart skip a beat. She immediately dropped her gaze to the floor, her hands tightening on her small basket. "Just the flour, Miss Miles, Mr." Henderson asked, his tone businesslike once more. "And the salt and thread," Hattie whispered, placing her items on the counter. He tallied the cost, and she carefully counted out the coins misses. Finch had given her. Then came the flour. It was a 20-pound sack, heavy and unwieldy. "Mr." Henderson grunted as he lifted it onto the counter, sliding it toward her. "There you are," he said, turning to arrange a display of canned peaches. Hattie reached for the sack. Her hands were still trembling from the encounter outside, a fine, uncontrollable tremor that she couldn't seem to quell. As her fingers closed around the coarse burlap, the shaking intensified. The sack was heavy, its weight poorly distributed. It tilted precariously. She saw it happening but was powerless to stop it. The sack began to slip from her grasp. In that instant, A large, sun-browned hand entered her field of vision. It moved not with speed, but with a quiet certainty, closing over the top of the sack to steady it. The man, the tall, quiet man she thought had left, had not gone. He had seen her struggle. His hand was warm and firm, and for a fraction of a second, his fingers brushed against her own. The contact was an electric shock. A gasp, thin and sharp, escaped her lips. She snatched her hands back as if the burlap sack were a hot stove, a primal, instinctual revulsion overriding all else. The touch, however brief and impersonal, was a violation. It was a hand she had not invited, a presence she had not sanctioned. Freed from both their grips, the sack of flour toppled off the counter and hit the floorboards with a heavy, muffled thud, sending a puff of white dust into the air. Silence descended upon the store, a thick, ringing silence. Mr. Henderson stopped his work, his head snapping around. Hattie stood frozen, staring at the fallen sack, her breath coming in ragged, shallow bursts. Her whole body was rigid with terror. She waited for the inevitable, the sharp word of annoyance, the condescending question, the angry outburst. She braced herself for the man's reaction, for the punishment that was sure to follow her inexplicable behavior. But it never came. She risked a glance at him. He had already taken a step back, putting a careful distance between them. His big hands were held slightly away from his body, open and unthreatening. He was looking not at her face, but at the flour sack on the floor, his expression unreadable. He saw her terror. It was impossible not to. It was radiating from her in waves. He did not speak. He did not ask what was wrong with her. He did not say, "I was only trying to help." Instead, he met her eyes for a second time, and then he gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. It wasn't a greeting. It was an acknowledgement, an acceptance of her silent, violent refusal. Then he turned, his worn boots making no sound on the dusty floor, and walked out of the store, leaving her alone with the consequences of her fear. Hattie stared after him, her mind a whirlwind of confusion. She had expected anger and had received only quiet. She had expected judgment and had been met with a silent departure. "For heaven's sake, girl, Mr. Henderson grumbled, coming around the counter to hoist the sack. "It's just flour." He inspected it for rips before placing it firmly back on the counter. He was just being helpful. Hattie didn't hear him. She paid for her things in a daze, grabbed the heavy sack, its weight now a penance, and fled the store. She didn't look to see if the tall man was still on the street. She scurried back toward the sanctuary of Mrs. Finch's property, her heart pounding a confused and frightened rhythm. Back in the safety of the barn loft, she slid the bolt on her door and leaned against it, the flour sack dropping to the floor beside her. She slid down the rough wood to sit, wrapping her arms around her knees. She replayed the moment over and over, the feel of his hand, the shock, her recoil. But what stuck with her most, what she couldn't understand, was his reaction. He had seen her break. He had seen her fear. And he had said nothing. He had simply walked away, for the first time since she'd fled her father's house. Hattie Miles had encountered a man whose response she could not predict, and, in its own way, it was just as unsettling as the fear itself. The days that followed the incident at the general store were quiet and shrouded in fear. Hattie confined herself to the small world of Mrs. Finch's property, a self-imposed prisoner. The gate at the end of the path became a barrier she was terrified to cross. The thought of the town, of the leering men outside the saloon, of the quiet gray eyes of the tall stranger, was enough to make her stomach clench. She threw herself into her work with a frantic energy, scrubbing floors that were already clean, weeding the garden until not a single unwanted sprout remained, and endlessly grooming Mrs. Finch's placid, long-suffering goat. The physical labor was a balm, a way to exhaust her body so her mind would have no energy left to torment her. "Mrs. Finch watched her with those sharp, knowing eyes, but said nothing, simply leaving a plate of food on the porch for Hattie to retrieve when she was ready. Hattie was grateful for the woman's unspoken understanding, for the space she was given to battle her invisible demons. Late one afternoon, nearly a week after her disastrous trip to the store, a new sound intruded upon her sanctuary. It wasn't the light, shuffling step of Mrs. Finch or the clucking of the chickens. It was a heavy, measured tread on the packed earth outside the barn. Hattie, who had been in her loft mending a tear in her own worn dress, froze instantly, the needle poised in her hand. Her heart began to pound a frantic, suffocating rhythm against her ribs. She crept to the small, grimy window of the loft and peered down. It was him, the tall man from the store, Calder Boone. She'd heard Mr. Henderson call him. He was standing in the yard, a respectful distance from the barn doors, holding a large, lumpy burlap sack. He wasn't looking toward her window. His gaze was fixed on the barn itself, as if he were studying the weathered wood. He stood there for a long moment, perfectly still, a silent, monolithic presence against the setting sun. Hattie shrank back from the window, her breath catching in her throat. Why was he here? Had he come to mock her? To demand an apology for her strange behavior? Panic, cold and sharp, flooded her veins. She retreated to the farthest, darkest corner of the loft, curling into herself, praying he would simply go away. But he didn't. After a minute of profound silence, a solid, deliberate knock echoed through the barn. Asterisk, knock, knock, knock. It wasn't an impatient or demanding sound. It was just a statement. Asterisk, I am here. Hattie squeezed her eyes shut, her hands clenched into fists. She didn't move. She didn't breathe. The silence stretched, thick and heavy. She imagined him turning, walking away, his boots crunching on the gravel, but the sound never came. He was waiting. His patience felt more unnerving than any anger could have. Finally, knowing he wouldn't leave, and terrified that Mrs. Finch might come out and draw more attention to the situation, Hattie forced her trembling legs to move. She descended the ladder from the loft, each rung a monumental effort. Her hands were slick with sweat as she approached the large barn door. She didn't touch the bolt. Instead, she peered through a wide crack between two of the planks. He was still there, exactly where he had been, his back to the setting sun, casting a long shadow that reached almost to her feet. He hadn't moved closer. He was giving her space, an entire yard of it. Slowly, her hands shaking so badly she could barely grasp the handle, she lifted the thick wooden latch and pulled the door inward, just a few inches, creating a narrow slit through which she could see and be seen. She remained half hidden behind the heavy wood, using it as a shield. Calder Boone didn't speak immediately. He simply looked at the sliver of her face visible in the opening. His gray eyes were steady, unreadable. When he finally spoke, his voice was a low, quiet rumble, devoid of any emotion she could name. It was just a sound, like stones shifting in a deep riverbed. "Miss Miles," he said, the name sounding strange and formal in the quiet air. He held up the burlap sack. "Folks say you're good with a needle." Hattie stared at him, confused. This was not what she had expected. There was no accusation in his tone, no reference to their previous encounter. He took a step forward, but stopped when he saw her flinch. He set the sack down on an old tree stump that sat midway between them. Then he stepped back again, re-establishing the distance. He reached into the sack and pulled out a heavy wool shirt. A large, jagged tear ran from the shoulder down the back, a wound in the thick fabric. "A man can't wear a cold shirt on the mountain," he said, his explanation simple and practical. "Caught this on a branch. There are others." He gestured to the sack. "Torn trousers, split seams. The work is hard on clothes. The men, they're not much for mending." He was offering her work. The realization dawned on her slowly, a sliver of light in her panicked mind. It wasn't charity. It wasn't a trick. It was a business proposition, stated as plainly and impersonally as a transaction for lumber. He needed a seamstress. He had heard she was one, She still couldn't find her voice, so she just stared, her eyes wide. He seemed to understand her silence. "I'll pay a fair price for each piece. You can tell me what it is when I come back." He paused. "I'll come back in a week's time, if you want the work." With that, he gave another one of his small, barely perceptible nods. He turned without waiting for an answer and walked away, his long strides eating up the ground. He didn't look back. Hattie stood behind the door for a long time, watching until he was gone. Only then did she slowly, cautiously, emerge from the barn. She approached the tree stump as if it might be a trap. The burlap sack sat there, solid and real. She tentatively reached out and pulled it toward her. It was heavy, filled with coarse, worn garments. Back in the lamplit safety of her loft, she emptied the contents. There were 4 heavy flannel shirts, 3 pairs of canvas trousers, and several pairs of thick wool socks, all in varying states of disrepair. They smelled of the outdoors of pine, wood smoke, and honest sweat. It was an intensely masculine scent, but it was the smell of labor, not of cloying cologne in a stuffy room. She picked up the first shirt, the one he had shown her. Her needle and thread, which had felt clumsy in her trembling hands moments before, now felt like an extension of herself. She found a matching patch of dark wool in Mrs. Finch's scrap basket. As she began to sew, something inside her settled. The work was methodical, demanding, and deeply satisfying. Her stitches were small and neat, a line of perfect, disciplined marks that drew the torn fabric together. Each pass of the needle was a deliberate act of creation, of repair. In her hands, a thing that was broken was becoming whole again. It was quiet work, the only sound the soft asterisk shush asterisk of the thread pulling through the wool. And in that quiet, the frantic noise in her head began to subside. She wasn't thinking about Silas Albright. She wasn't thinking about the men at the saloon. She was thinking only of the next stitch, and the one after that. For the rest of the week, the mending became her world. It gave her a purpose that was entirely her own. This wasn't a chore for Mrs. Finch in exchange for shelter. This was a job. She was earning her own way. The rhythm of the work was a meditation. Push the needle through, pull the thread taut, order from chaos. Repairing the tangible tears in these garments felt like she was somehow mending the invisible ones inside herself. A week later, at the exact same time of day, she heard his footsteps again. This time, her heart still beat faster, but the sheer, mind-numbing panic was gone, replaced by a nervous tension. She took the neatly folded and repaired clothes and placed them on the tree stump. Then she retreated to the barn, leaving the door slightly ajar. He arrived just as before. He walked to the stump, picked up the mended clothes, and inspected one of the shirts. He ran a large thumb over her neat line of stitches. Then he replaced the bundle with another burlap sack, and next to it, he placed a small, heavy leather pouch. He turned and left, without a word, without a look toward the barn. After he was gone, she retrieved the pouch. Inside were coins. She counted them. He had paid her more than generously. And so the ritual began. Every week, like clockwork, Calder Boone would arrive. He would leave a sack of torn clothing and a pouch of coins, and he would take the mended bundle away. They never spoke. There was no need. He had created a space for her, a silent agreement that she could honor without having to face him, without having to speak, without having to be touched. He had seen her fear, and instead of questioning it or challenging it, he had simply found a way to work around it. And in doing so, he had given her something she hadn't realized. She'd lost a small, quiet piece of her life that she could finally control. The changing of the seasons had begun to work its slow magic on Raven's Rest. The relentless, bleached-out sun of summer had softened, and the afternoons were now filled with a golden, hazy light. A crispness touched the evening air, carrying the scent of drying leaves and the promise of coming cold. Hattie found a quiet peace in the rhythm of her days. The weekly mending for Calder Boone's logging crew had become the anchor of her existence. The silent, predictable exchange was a language she understood, a relationship built on the sturdy foundations of distance and respect. Her world was still small, but it no longer felt like a cage. It was a garden she tended carefully. She knew the exact spot on the porch where the morning sun was warmest, the particular way Mrs. Finch's goat would butt its head against her leg for a scratch. The satisfying weight of the coins Calder left for her work. These small, tangible certainties were rebuilding her, stitch by careful stitch. She was in the garden, humming softly to herself as she harvested the last of the hardy autumn herbs for Mrs. Finch, when the peaceful afternoon was shattered. It began with a frantic bleating from the goat, followed by a sudden, violent shriek from a horse and a man's sharp curse. Hattie shot upright, her blood turning to ice. Her first instinct was to run, to bolt herself inside the barn and hide until the danger passed. Loud noises and male anger were the twin triggers that sent her spiraling back into the dark. She took a half-step toward the barn, her body already coiling in on itself. But then, through the picket fence, she saw him. It was Calder Boone. He wasn't on the property, but on the well-worn track that ran alongside it, his usual route back toward the mountains. His horse, a sturdy-looking roan, was skittering nervously, its eyes wide. Calder was on the ground, pushing himself up slowly, his face tight with pain. The conflict inside Hattie was a physical storm. "Run, hide, he's a man, it's dangerous." But another voice, quieter and newer, rose to meet the panic. It's him. It's Calder Boone. The man who had never crowded her, never demanded anything of her, never even spoken more than a handful of words to her. The man who had seen her at her most broken and had offered not judgment, but a quiet transaction that had given her back a piece of herself. He tried to stand, putting weight on his left leg, and a sharp grunt of pain escaped his lips. He stumbled, catching himself against the side of his now calm horse. He was hurt. The quiet voice won, before she was even fully aware of her own decision. Hattie was moving. She dropped her basket of herbs, her hands fumbling with the latch on the garden gate. She walked toward him, her steps hesitant at first, then more certain. Her heart was still hammering, but for the first time, it was propelled by something other than fear. It was concern. He saw her approaching and made an effort to straighten up, his expression hardening into a mask of stoicism. "I'm all right," he said, his voice strained. Horse was spooked by the goat. Hattie stopped a few feet away from him, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. She could see now that his ankle was turned at an unnatural angle, already beginning to swell against the leather of his boot. "You can't stand on that," she said, her own voice a reedy whisper she barely recognized. "I'm fine," he insisted, his jaw tight with stubborn pride. He took another step and his leg buckled, a wave of pain washing over his face, leaving him pale beneath his tan. He leaned heavily against the horse, breathing hard. The sight of his vulnerability, his very real and undeniable pain, did something to Hattie that weeks of quiet respect had not. It made him human. He was not a threat. He was a man in need. "The porch," she said, her voice a little stronger now. "You should sit on the porch. Mrs. Finch has liniments." He looked from his injured ankle to the house, then back to her. A flicker of something resignation, maybe, passed through his gray eyes. He gave a short, sharp nod. He tried to move, using the horse as a crutch, but the distance was too great, his steps too unsteady. He faltered again, his weight shifting dangerously. In that moment, Hattie acted on pure instinct. She closed the distance between them in 2 quick steps and reached out to support him. Her hand, small and calloused from her garden work, landed on his right forearm. The world seemed to stop. The shock of the contact was immediate and visceral. The fabric of his shirt was coarse beneath her palm and under it. His arm was like a band of iron, hard and unyielding. The warmth of his skin seeped through the cloth, a living heat that was profoundly terrifyingly male. The familiar panic surged, a cold wave cresting inside her, screaming at her to pull back, to sever the connection, to retreat to a safe distance. Her fingers tensed, ready to recoil as they had done so many times before. But she didn't. Her hand remained on his arm. She could feel the rigid muscles there, tense with pain and the effort of staying upright. She felt the slight tremor that ran through him, and she held on. In the split second that felt like an eternity, her mind raced. Asterisk. This is not the cold, clammy hand of Silas Albright. This is not a touch that claims ownership. This is a touch that accepts help. He was leaning on her, just a fraction of his weight, but it was a gesture of trust. He was hurt, and she was helping him. She was in control. She held her breath, waiting for the world to shatter. But all that happened was that his breathing steadied slightly. He was still looking straight ahead, his jaw clenched, but he accepted her support. Slowly, awkwardly, they made their way across the yard. Each step was a trial for him, and Hattie focused on the task at hand, on keeping him steady, on the feel of the solid muscle beneath her hand. It was a strange and terrifying intimacy, this physical contact born of necessity. She was acutely aware of his size, of the sheer power held in the body she was now helping to support. But for the first time, that power didn't feel threatening. It felt contained. They reached the 3 shallow steps of Mrs. Finch's porch. Getting him seated was the final, clumsy hurdle, as he lowered himself onto the top step with a grimace of pain. Her hand naturally slid from his forearm to his bicep to steady his descent. The muscle there was even harder. Like old oak, the touch was firmer, more definite, and still, she did not pull away. Her hand lingered there for a moment after he was seated, a silent testament to the monumental shift that had just occurred within her. Calder sat with his head bowed for a moment, catching his breath. He didn't look at her. Critically, he did not look at her hand, which was still resting on his arm. He seemed to understand, with some deep animal intuition, that to acknowledge the touch would be to frighten it away. To name it would be to break the spell. Instead, he stared at his injured ankle, his face a mask of controlled pain. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. It wasn't a thank you. It was deeper than that. It was an acknowledgement of her help, of her bravery, of the fragile truce she had just declared with the world. Hattie slowly, deliberately, withdrew her hand. The back of her fingers brushed against his shirt, and the ghost of his warmth remained on her skin. She took a step back, her role as his support now over. She looked down at her own hand, half expecting it to be trembling. It was perfectly steady. Just then, the screen door creaked open and Mrs. Finch emerged, a scowl on her face. "What in tarnation is all the commotion? Oh, Lord have mercy!" She took in the scene at a glance, Calder on her step, his swollen ankle, Hattie standing nearby, pale but composed. "Don't you move a muscle, Calder Boone," she commanded, disappearing back inside. She returned a moment later with a basin of water, clean rags, and a dark brown bottle that smelled sharply of wintergreen. As the old woman knelt and began the practical, no-nonsense work of tending to his injury, Hattie retreated to the far side of the porch. She sank down onto the steps, wrapping her arms around her knees, and watched. Her mind was quiet. The roaring panic was gone. In its place was a strange, profound stillness. She had reached out. She had touched someone, and she hadn't shattered into 1,000 pieces. She was still whole. Mrs. Finch was a woman of brusque efficiency. She worked on Calder's ankle with a practiced hand, her movements deft and sure as she applied a foul-smelling but wonderfully cooling poultice and wrapped the joint in clean, tight bandages. She clucked and tutted, muttering about clumsy horses and men too stubborn to watch where they were putting their feet. But her touch was gentle. Throughout the ordeal, Calder remained silent, his face a stoic mask that only tightened when a particular movement sent a fresh jolt of pain through him. Hattie watched from her safe distance on the porch steps, an observer in a scene she had unwittingly set in motion. The memory of her hand on his arm was a phantom warmth, a ghost of sensation that both terrified and intrigued her. She had crossed a line, one she had drawn around herself in thick, indelible ink, and the world had not ended. She felt fragile, exposed, but also strangely solid, as if in the act of supporting him, she had found a new and unfamiliar strength within herself. "There, Mrs.," Finch said, tying off the last bandage. "That should hold you, but you'll be no good on that foot for a week or more. You'll need to get back to your camp and stay put." A new problem presented itself. The logging camp was miles up the mountain, a hard ride even for a healthy man. Getting onto his horse would be a challenge in itself. "I can manage," Calder said, his voice low and gravelly. "Don't be a fool, Mrs., Finch retorted. "You'll fall and break your fool neck before you're halfway there." Calder's jaw tightened. He was a man accustomed to solitude and self-reliance. The idea of being dependent, even for a moment, was clearly a bitter pill. He looked at his horse, which was now grazing peacefully by the fence, then at his own immobilized ankle. Hattie found herself speaking before she had formed the thought. "I can help you to your horse," she said quietly. "Both Calder and Mrs." Finch turned to look at her. The offer hung in the air, thick with unspoken meaning. It was more than an offer of assistance. It was a confirmation of the change that had just taken place. She was not retreating. She was stepping forward. Calder held her gaze for a long moment, his gray eyes searching her face. He seemed to understand the cost of her offer. He gave a single, slow nod. "I'd be obliged." "Mrs. Finch, seeing a solution, provided the means." She fetched a sturdy walking stick she kept for her own rambles in the woods. With the stick in one hand and his other arm slung gingerly over Hattie's shoulders, a contact that was both necessary and fraught with a terrifying newness, they managed to get him to his feet. The journey from the porch to the track was a slow, agonizingly intimate procession. Hattie was acutely aware of his weight against her, of the heat of his body, of the scent of pine and clean sweat that clung to him. She moved with a stiff, careful grace, her entire being focused on the simple, mechanical act of putting one foot in front of the other. He leaned on her just enough to keep his balance, his touch surprisingly light, as if he were trying to spare her as much of his burden as possible. Once they reached the horse, he let go of her and leaned against the saddle. The brief, necessary intimacy was over. Hattie felt a strange mix of relief and an odd, hollow sense of loss. "Thank you, Miss Miles," he said formally, his gaze on the horse's mane. "I can manage from here." But Hattie didn't leave. She stood there, twisting a loose thread on her sleeve, a silent spectator. Something held her there, a question that had been a constant, burning coal in the pit of her stomach for months. A question she had never dared to give voice to, for fear the answer would utterly destroy her. His presence, his quiet acceptance, his utter lack of judgment, it had created a crack in the armor she had so carefully constructed around her heart. And now, the question was forcing its way through. The sun was sinking behind the mountains, painting the sky in fiery strokes of orange and purple. The world grew quiet, the air cooling rapidly, in the soft twilight, surrounded by a silence that felt both vast and deeply personal. She spoke. Her voice was barely a whisper, so quiet she wasn't sure if he had heard it over the horse's soft snorting. "Mr. Boone." He turned his head slightly, his profile a rugged silhouette against the dying light. The words tumbled out of her, raw and unbidden, like a prayer torn from the deepest part of her soul. "If a woman," she began, her throat tightening. She swallowed hard and forced herself to continue. "If she has been owned before by another man," the words tasted like poison, the shame of them a physical weight, "and if she isn't whole anymore, Can she still be cared for? She finished in a rush, the final words catching in her throat. She immediately wished she could snatch them back from the air. The vulnerability was excruciating. She felt naked, her deepest, most shameful wound laid bare for his inspection. She flinched inwardly, bracing for the inevitable, a shocked silence, a look of pity, or worst of all, disgust. She had asked the unaskable, and now she would pay the price. Calder did not answer right away. The silence stretched, each second a fresh torment for Hattie. He didn't look at her. He continued to face his horse, one hand resting on the worn leather of the saddle. He seemed to be looking out at the vast, darkening landscape, at the first stars beginning to prick the deep violet sky. She thought he was ignoring her, that her question was too ugly to be answered. The shame burned hotter, and she wanted to turn and run back to the barn and never, ever show her face again. When he finally spoke, his voice was as quiet and steady as the coming night. It was not filled with pity, nor comfort, nor any of the false reassurances she might have expected. It was simple, and it was honest. "I reckon," he said slowly, his gaze still fixed on the horizon, "a person can start over." He paused, letting the words settle in the space between them. Hattie held her breath. "If they want to," he added. And that was all. He didn't say more. He didn't need to. With a grunt of effort, he managed to pull himself into the saddle. His injured leg held stiffly out. He gathered the reins, his large hands sure and competent. He looked down at her then, just for a moment, and his expression in the deepening twilight was unreadable. He gave his customary nod, a gesture that now seemed to hold a world of meaning, and turned his horse toward the mountain path. Hattie stood frozen, watching until the sound of his horse's hoofbeats faded into nothing. She stood there long after he was gone, the evening chill seeping into her bones. Asterisk, a person can start over, if they want to. He had not said a woman. He had said a person, lifting her shame out of the specific, gendered prison where it had lived. He had made her wound a human one, not a female failing, and he had given the power back to her. Asterisk, if they want to. The choice, he was saying, was hers. The possibility of a new beginning was not something to be granted by another, but something to be claimed by oneself. She walked back to the barn in a daze. She climbed the ladder to her loft, the familiar scent of hay and dust a small comfort. She sat on her cot in the darkness, the sounds of the night pressing in. That night, for the first time since she had fled that cold, suffocating house in the east, Hattie Miles cried. She didn't make a sound, burying her face in her thin blanket. The tears were not for the pain of the past, for the violation she had endured, or for the father who had sold her. Those were old, stagnant sorrows. These tears were different. They were hot and cleansing, a flood of grief and relief that broke through the dam of numbness she had built inside herself. She wept for the girl who had been so terribly broken, and for the woman who, for the first time, had just been given a reason to believe she might one day be whole again. Calder Boone's injury, and Hattie's role in it, acted like a stone thrown into the still, murky pond of Raven's Rest society. The ripples spread quickly. Small towns thrive on speculation, and the sight of the reclusive lumber boss being helped by the mysterious woman from Mrs. Odelia's barn was a feast for the gossips. It began subtly, as these things always do. A raised eyebrow between two women over a fence post, a hushed question at the general store. "Did you see them?" Her hand on his arm. "Bold as you please." The weekly delivery of mending, once an unnoticed transaction, was now re-examined, recast in a more sordid light. Why would a man like Calder Boone, who kept to himself up on the mountain, have any business with a strange, silent woman who lived in a barn? The narrative, fed by boredom and suspicion, quickly wrote itself. Hattie's past, a complete blank to the townsfolk, became a canvas on which they could paint their darkest assumptions. The first whispers labeled her a runaway wife. It was a common enough story, and carried with it a certain romantic, if tragic, air. But that story soon soured. A wife who runs has broken a sacred vow. She is a woman of weak character, untrustworthy. From there, the slide was quick and steep. At the saloon, where whiskey loosened tongues and sharpened cruelties, the speculation grew uglier. A woman alone, with no family and no visible means of support save for the patronage of a single man. The conclusion was as simple as it was vicious. She was a fallen woman, selling her comfort for his coin. The word whore was never spoken to her face, but it hovered in the air, a poisonous, unspoken cloud that followed her whenever she was forced to venture into town. Hattie felt the change before she ever heard the words. It was in the sudden chill that fell over a conversation when she approached. It was in the way women would gather their skirts a little closer, as if her presence were a contagion. Men who had once ignored her now looked at her with a new, speculative gleam in their eyes, a look of cheap appraisal that made her skin crawl and sent her scurrying back to the safety of the garden gate. The hope that had taken root in her heart after Calder's quiet words began to wither. The town's judgment was a harsh frost, threatening to kill the fragile new growth. Asterisk. A person can start over. It had seemed so possible in the quiet twilight, but how could a person start over when the world was determined to nail them to the cross of their past, real or imagined? The urge to retreat, to pull the barn door shut and never emerge, was a powerful, suffocating tide. Mrs. Odelia was a bulwark against the worst of it. The old woman seemed to have ears everywhere, and her tongue was as sharp as her pruning shears. She confronted Martha Pringle by the town well, her voice carrying across the dusty street. "You'd do better to worry about the state of your own husband's soul, Martha, than to invent sins for a girl who works harder in a day than you have in a year." But Mrs. Odelia couldn't be everywhere, and her defense only seemed to convince the town that she was a foolish old woman, taken in by a clever seductress. Calder, his ankles slowly healing, continued his weekly visits. The ritual did not change. He would limp to the stump, exchange the bundles, and leave. But now, his silent arrivals and departures were watched by dozens of unseen eyes. He had to know what was being said. Hattie could see it in the hard set of his jaw, in the way his gaze swept the street before he turned onto the path to the barn. The whispers were about him as much as they were about her. Yet he never spoke of it. His silence was a wall, and she didn't know if it was meant to protect her or if he was simply ignoring the ugliness. Then, one morning, something changed. Hattie rose before dawn, as was her habit, to fetch water. The air was cold and sharp, the sky a pale, pre-dawn gray. As she stepped out of the barn, she saw a new shape in the yard, a dark silhouette by the front gate. Her heart leaped into her throat, but the shape was still unmoving. Cautiously, she approached. It was a chair, a simple, straight-backed chair made of sturdy, unpainted pine. It was new. She could smell the fresh-cut wood. It had been placed just outside Mrs. Odelia's gate, angled to face the main street. It wasn't set back in the shelter of the yard, but placed right on the edge of the public track. A bold and deliberate statement. From that chair, one could see everything: the general store, the saloon, the blacksmith's forge, the church steeple, and in turn, anyone sitting in it could be seen by everyone. There was no note. There was no sign of who had left it. But Hattie knew. She ran a hand over the smooth, sanded wood of the armrest. She could picture his large, capable hands planing the wood, fitting the joints, creating this simple, solid thing. This was his answer to the whispers. He would not engage in a war of words he couldn't win. He would not dignify the rumors with a denial. Instead, he had built her a throne. He had created a space for her not in the shadows, but in the full, unforgiving light of day. He wasn't telling her to hide. He was inviting her to be seen. The chair was not a piece of furniture. It was a challenge. Asterisk, sit here. It seemed to say, "Show them you are not afraid." Fear was a cold knot in her stomach. The thought of sitting there, exposed to every stare, every whisper, every judgmental glance, was terrifying. It was everything she had been running from. Hiding was her shield, her only defense. To give it up felt like suicide. She spent the morning in turmoil, her mending lying untouched in her lap. She could hear the town waking up, the rumble of a wagon, the clang of the blacksmith's hammer, the distant chatter of voices. She could feel the weight of their collective gaze. Even from inside the barn, the chair sat out there, empty, a silent testament to a challenge she was too cowardly to accept. Then she thought of his words. If they want to. The choice was hers. She could let the whispers of strangers define her, drive her back into the darkness where shame festered. Or she could choose to believe the words of the one man who had shown her quiet, unwavering respect. She could choose to start over. That afternoon, when the sun was high and the street was at its busiest, Hattie made her choice, with her heart hammering against her ribs so hard she felt dizzy. She picked up her mending basket. She walked out of the barn, across the yard, and through the gate. She walked to the pine chair, its wood warm from the sun. She sat down. The fabric of her skirt settled around her. She placed her basket at her feet. She took out a heavy wool shirt with a torn cuff and threaded her needle, and she began to sew. At first, she kept her eyes fixed on her work, her knuckles white as she gripped the needle. She could feel the stares. It was a physical sensation, like the heat of a fire. She could hear the sudden halt of conversations, the murmur that followed. She wanted to shrink, to run, to disappear. But the chair was solid beneath her. The sun was warm on her back, and the rhythm of her work was a familiar comfort. Push the needle through. Pull the thread taut. Slowly, she forced herself to lift her head. She looked straight down the main street of Raven's Rest. She saw Mrs. Pringle stopped dead in her tracks, her mouth a perfect O of surprise. She saw the men lounging on the porch of the general store fall silent, their eyes on her. She did not glare. She did not smile. She simply met their gaze, her expression calm and neutral, before returning her attention to her sewing. She was not a spectacle to be pitied or a sinner to be condemned. She was a woman, sitting in the afternoon sun, doing her work. It became her daily ritual. Every afternoon, she would carry her mending and her quiet dignity to the chair by the gate. She sat there for hours, her needle flying, a silent, unmovable fixture in the town's landscape. The whispers didn't stop. Not at first, but they lost their power. It is hard to gossip with venom about a person who sits calmly before you, refusing to be shamed. Her quiet defiance was a stronger rebuttal than any angry denial. She was not hiding. And in front of the whole town, Hattie Miles, with a simple needle and thread, began to stitch herself back together. The circuit preacher came through Raven's Rest on the first Sunday of October, a thin, wind-burned man with a powerful voice that seemed too big for his small frame. He held his service not in the half-finished church, but on the hill just west of town, where a few simple wooden crosses marked the town's first graves. It was an old tradition, a way of remembering that life in this hard country was a fragile thing, held between the vastness of the earth and the sky. To Hattie's own astonishment, she went, "Mrs." Odelia had simply laid out a clean, mended dress for her, a dark blue calico, and said, "The air on that hill does a body good." It wasn't a command, but a simple statement of fact. And Hattie, feeling the strange, new pull of wanting to belong to the world again, had put it on. Her chair by the gate had been her battleground, a place of silent defiance. But walking up that hill with the other women of the town, their skirts rustling in the dry grass, felt different. It was an act of joining. People nodded to her, their expressions more curious than hostile now. Her quiet persistence had worn away the sharpest edges of their judgment, replacing it with a grudging respect. She was no longer just the strange woman in the barn. She was a fixed point in their daily lives. Calder Boone was there. He stood at the back of the small congregation, his recently healed ankle making him favor his right side slightly. He didn't look at her, but she was aware of him. A tall, solid presence at the edge of her vision. His being there felt like a silent endorsement, a quiet guard against any lingering whispers. After the last hymn had been carried away by the wind, the small crowd dispersed. Calder's weekly mending exchange had become a quiet routine, but today he broke it. As Hattie and Mrs. Odelia started down the path, he approached, his large horse in tow. "Ma'am," he said, nodding to Mrs. Odelia. Then his gray eyes found Hattie. "It's a long walk back. I can see Miss Miles home." The offer was public, simple, and deeply protective. It was a clear statement to anyone watching. Mrs. Odelia's eyes twinkled as she handed Hattie her small hymnal. "That's a fine idea. Calder, my old bones could use the rest." Hattie's heart began a slow, heavy drumbeat. Riding with him felt like a monumental step, a journey into a new and uncharted territory. He led the horse to a large rock, and from there, she was able to settle onto the saddle behind him. She didn't sit directly against him, but perched awkwardly, her hands gripping the hard leather of the cantle until her knuckles were white. Still, the warmth from his back radiated into the space between them, a living heat that was both unsettling and strangely comforting. He walked the horse slowly, his movements measured and calm, as if he understood the fragile truce she was making with her own fear. They didn't take the direct path back to the cottage. Instead, he guided the horse up a winding trail that led to a high ridge overlooking the town. When they reached the top, he stopped. The whole of Raven's Rest was laid out below them, a miniature world of dusty streets and sun-bleached rooftops. The wind was stronger up here, clean and sharp, and it pulled at the loose strands of hair around Hattie's face. For a long time, they just sat in silence. The only sounds, the creak of saddle leather and the sigh of the wind through the pines. Calder broke the silence, his voice a low rumble that seemed to be part of the landscape itself. "You see it from up here," he said, not looking at her. "It's just a place, a small place, not as big as it feels when you're down in it." He paused, then turned his head slightly, his profile etched against the vast blue sky. "You don't have to hide here. Hattie," he had used her name, not Miss Miles, but Hattie. The simple, familiar sound of it, spoken in his quiet voice, undid something deep inside her. All the progress she had made, all the quiet acts of bravery, all the stitches she had used to mend her life felt suddenly inadequate. The core of her wound, the one she kept hidden even from herself, chose that moment to break open. A choked, desperate sound escaped her lips. The words came out in a ragged whisper, laden with a shame so profound it felt like a physical sickness. "I don't know," she began, her voice trembling so badly she could barely form the words. She stared down at her own hands, at the fingers that had mended so many other broken things but could not fix the ruin inside her. "I don't know if I'm worth touching anymore." The confession, once spoken, seemed to suck all the air from the world. It was her deepest, most guarded truth. It was the verdict she had passed on herself in the dark of that locked room. She was spoiled, used, a thing whose value had been taken. Calder did not respond with words. Answering her shame required more than language. With a slow, fluid movement, he swung his leg over the saddle and dropped to the ground. He stood for a moment, looking up at her, his face serious, his gray eyes holding hers with an unnerving intensity. He was no longer a figure of authority on horseback. He was a man on the ground, meeting her where she was. Slowly, deliberately, he raised his hand. Hattie's breath caught. She watched his hand come toward her, large and calloused, a map of hard labor and a life lived outdoors. It moved with no haste, no demand. It was an offering, not a taking. He was giving her time. Time to flinch, time to pull away, time to say no, Her every instinct screamed at her to retreat, to protect the raw wound she had just exposed. But she didn't move. She watched his hand come closer, and in his eyes she saw not pity, not desire, but a deep, steady calm. She saw a man who was not afraid of her brokenness. His fingers, warm and rough, closed gently around her hand where it still gripped the saddle. He didn't squeeze. He didn't pull. He simply held it. The contact was a bolt of lightning, but it was not the searing shock of violation. It was a current of pure, undiluted warmth that seemed to travel up her arm and straight into the cold, empty space in her chest. He held her gaze, his thumb stroking softly over her trembling knuckles. "If you let me touch you," he said, his voice low and incredibly gentle, each word chosen with the care of a man building something to last. "I'll touch you like it's the first time." He wasn't promising to erase the past. He was promising to consecrate the present. He wasn't pretending the damage hadn't been done. He was vowing to handle her as if she were brand new, precious, and whole. In his words, he was offering to give her back the one thing she thought had been stolen from her forever a beginning. Tears welled in Hattie's eyes, blurring the image of his face. They were not the silent, grieving tears of the barn loft. They were tears of a hope so fierce and overwhelming it was painful. She couldn't speak. She could only sit there, high above the town, with the wind in her hair, and her hand held firmly, gently, in his, and for the first time in a very, very long time. She felt the possibility of being truly, completely whole. The journey down from the ridge was a descent into a world made new. Calder walked, leading the horse, while Hattie sat in the saddle. He still held her hand, his larger one enveloping hers, a steady, warm anchor in the deepening twilight. The silence between them was no longer empty or awkward. It was a vessel, filled with the weight of her confession and the quiet gravity of his promise. Every so often, his thumb would move, a slow, reassuring stroke over her knuckles, and each time, a small tremor of something other than fear would run through her. She watched the back of his head, the way the dark, wheat-colored hair curled slightly at his collar, the powerful set of his shoulders. He moved with a purpose that was both gentle and absolute. He was not leading her to a destination of his choosing. He was simply walking with her, his presence a shield against the gathering dark. The world around them seemed to hold its breath, the chirping of crickets, the rustle of a night animal in the undergrowth, the distant call of a whip-poor-will. All of it felt like a soft, respectful chorus accompanying their silent procession. When they reached the bottom of the trail, the lights of Raven's Rest were scattered, welcoming beacons in the vast darkness. A single lamp burned in the window of Mrs. Odelia's cottage, a warm, golden square. Hattie tensed, expecting him to lead the horse to the gate, to deliver her back to her familiar world with a polite nod. It was the proper, expected thing to do. But Calder did not turn toward the cottage. He continued on the path that led directly to the barn. He stopped at the great, weathered doors, and finally released her hand to tether the horse to a post. The absence of his touch was immediate, a sudden chill against her skin. He turned to her, his face shadowed and unreadable. He didn't speak, didn't motion, he simply waited. He was ceding control, making it clear that the next step, the crossing of this threshold, was her decision alone. This was her sanctuary, and he would not enter uninvited. Hattie slid down from the saddle, her legs unsteady. She looked at the barn doors, the entrance to the first place she had ever felt truly safe, the place where she had bolted the door against the world. To bring him inside felt like an act of profound and terrifying trust, like letting him into the most secret, fragile room of her heart. She thought of his promise on the ridge. "I'll touch you like it's the first time." Taking a deep, shuddering breath, she reached for the thick wooden latch. The door groaned softly as she pulled it open, revealing the deep, familiar darkness within. A space that smelled of sweet hay, old leather, and the warm, living scent of animals. She stepped inside, and after a moment's hesitation, he followed, ducking his head to clear the low beam. He closed the door behind them, plunging them into a soft, velvety blackness, shutting out the rest of the world. For a moment, they stood in the silence, letting their eyes adjust. The only light was a pale silver sliver that fell through a crack high in the wall, illuminating a swirl of dust motes in the still air. Hattie moved with a newfound certainty, her hands finding the familiar shape of the lantern and a box of matches. A moment later, a small, steady flame flickered to life, pushing the darkness back into the corners and casting a warm, gentle glow over the space. She led the way to the ladder, her heart a wild bird in her chest. He followed her up into the loft, his weight making the old wood creak and groan. The small, partitioned space that had been her entire world seemed to shrink with his presence. Yet it didn't feel crowded. It felt occupied, filled. The lantern light softened the rough-hewn walls and the piles of hay. It danced over her small cot with its single, thin blanket, the stack of mended shirts in the corner, and the little basket where she kept her needles and thread. It was a humble, Spartan space, a testament to a life stripped down to its barest essentials. Hattie felt a sudden flush of shame at its poverty, its smallness. But Calder didn't seem to notice. He looked around the small loft, his gaze lingering on the neat stitches of the shirt on top of the pile, and a look of profound respect settled on his features. He was not seeing a place of lack. He was seeing a place of survival, of quiet, determined work. He shrugged out of his heavy wool coat, the one he wore against the mountain cold. It was a gesture that made him seem both larger and more vulnerable. He didn't place it on her cot. That space was hers, and he would not presume. Instead, he turned to a clean, empty corner of the loft. With a slow, deliberate motion, he spread the coat over the clean hay, the dark wool a soft blanket against the rough straw. He created a new space for them, a space that belonged to neither of them and yet to both of them. Then he sat down on the edge of the coat, his back against the wall, and he waited. Once again, the choice was hers. Hattie stood by the lantern, her shadow long and trembling on the wall. This was the precipice. Every instinct for self-preservation, honed by a lifetime of caution and a single night of terror, screamed at her to stay where she was. But the memory of his hand holding hers, the quiet promise in his eyes, pulled at her with a gentle, inexorable force. Slowly, as if moving through deep water, she crossed the small space and sat down on the coat, a careful foot of distance between them. She sat rigidly, her hands clenched in her lap, her gaze fixed on a single piece of straw. Calder didn't move to close the distance. He simply sat beside her in the warm, lantern-lit silence. He let her acclimate, let her breathe, let the frantic beating of her heart begin to slow. When he finally moved, it was only to lift an arm, a slow, telegraphing motion that gave her ample time to protest or flee. He didn't reach for her waist or her shoulders. He simply rested his arm on the wall behind her, creating a protective space, a partial enclosure that didn't quite touch her. And in that space, Hattie began to feel a slow, melting warmth. The silence stretched, comfortable and profound. Finally, he spoke, his voice so low it was almost a vibration she felt more than heard. "I don't need you to forget the past," he said, his gaze on the flickering lantern flame. "I don't need you to pretend it didn't happen." He turned his head then, and his gray eyes, soft and serious in the warm light, met hers. "I just need you to know," he said, his voice thick with an emotion she couldn't name, "that I'm not like it." His words were a key, unlocking the last, rusted mechanism of her fear. A single tear escaped her eye and traced a hot path down her cheek. He didn't wipe it away. He simply watched it fall, a silent witness to her pain and her release. Slowly, tentatively, Hattie leaned into the space he had created for her. She rested her head against his shoulder. It was solid, unmovable, a bulwark against the world. And then he completed the circle, his arm coming to rest around her shoulders, pulling her gently against his side. He didn't pull her into a possessive embrace. He just held her. Hattie closed her eyes, and for the first time she allowed herself to feel the full weight of another person's presence without flinching. His arm was heavy, warm, and profoundly safe. She could feel the steady, slow beat of his heart through the thick fabric of his shirt. It was the rhythm of life, calm and strong. She breathed in the scent of him, pine and wool and clean, cold air, and it was the scent of the mountain, of freedom. This was the touch he had promised. Not a taking, but a giving. Not a demand, but a sanctuary. He held her as one might hold a rescued bird, with a strength that was gentle, a firmness that was protective, and in the quiet, golden light of the barn loft, held in the arms of the man who had seen her brokenness and called it a beginning. Hattie Miles finally felt safe. The first light to filter through the cracks in the barn wall was thin and gray, the color of ash. Hattie awoke slowly, not with the familiar jolt of fear, but with a gradual, peaceful surfacing from a deep and dreamless sleep. For a moment, she was disoriented. The air was cold, but she was cocooned in a profound warmth. She was lying on her cot, tucked tightly under her own thin blanket, and another, heavier weight was spread on top of her. It was his coat. She sat up, her heart giving a single, hard thump. He was gone. The loft was empty, the lantern extinguished, the space once again hers alone, but his coat, smelling faintly of pine, wool, and the clean scent of the man himself, was a solid, tangible presence. He had covered her in the night, a silent, protective gesture, and had left before the sun rose. Hattie drew the heavy garment around her shoulders. The wool was coarse against her skin, but the warmth was absolute. It was a shield, a promise. She sat there for a long time as the light grew stronger, simply breathing in the scent of him, letting the feeling of safety seep into her bones. She felt quiet inside. The frantic, skittish animal that had lived in her chest for so long was finally still. She had not been violated. She had not been taken. She had been held. She had been seen in all her brokenness, and she had been offered not pity, but a quiet, steady strength. The night had not been about passion or romance. It had been about the slow, patient laying of a foundation, the first stone of trust. When the sun was fully up, casting golden shafts of light through the dusty air, Hattie knew what she had to do. The whispers and the stares of the town had not magically vanished. The chair by the gate was a statement, but it was a defensive one. Today required something more. Today, she would not sit and wait for the world to come to her. She would walk out to meet it. She washed her face in the cold water from the basin, her movements deliberate. She dressed in the simple blue calico she had worn to the service on the hill. It was the best she had. Then, taking a deep breath, she slipped her arms into the sleeves of Calder's coat. It was far too big for her, the shoulders broad, the sleeves hanging past her hands. On her small frame, it was not just a piece of clothing, it was a declaration. It was an unmistakable banner, a claim of allegiance seen and understood by all. With the coat wrapped around her, she walked not to the garden, but to Mrs. Odelia's kitchen door. The old woman was there, kneading dough, and she looked up as Hattie entered. Her sharp blue eyes took in the coat, Hattie's steady gaze, and a slow, knowing smile creased her wrinkled face. "Going to the store, are we?" she asked, her voice raspy. "Yes, ma'am," Hattie said, her own voice quiet but clear. "I need bread and thread." "Mrs.?" Odelia simply nodded. "Take the good basket." The walk to the general store was the longest of Hattie's life. The dust of the main street felt different under her boots. The morning air was crisp and clean. She did not lower her eyes. She did not hunch her shoulders. She kept her head held high, the unfamiliar weight of the coat a constant, reassuring presence. She felt the stairs before she saw them. As she stepped onto the boardwalk, a hush fell. It started with a group of women gossiping near the town well. Their chatter cut short as if by a knife. It spread to the men lounging outside the saloon, their lazy talk ceasing. The rhythmic clang of the blacksmith's hammer faltered, then stopped altogether. The entire street seemed to fall silent, every eye turning to the small woman in the oversized coat. They saw her, and they saw the coat. It was Calder Boone's. There wasn't a soul in Raven's Rest who didn't recognize it, and they understood what it meant. This was not the mark of a furtive, shameful liaison. This was a public act of protection, of alignment. Hattie felt a tremor of her old fear, the instinct to flee from their collective gaze, but she thought of the quiet strength in his hands, the promise in his eyes. She walked on, her steps even and unhurried. She saw Martha Pringle, her face a mask of shock and thwarted malice. She saw the men from the saloon, their leering grins replaced by expressions of confusion and a newfound caution. No one laughed. No one dared. To mock her now would be to mock the man whose presence was a silent, formidable shadow standing right behind her. She pushed open the door to the general store. The few customers inside fell silent as well. Mr. Henderson looked up from behind the counter, his eyes widening for a fraction of a second before his usual scowl returned, though it seemed to lack its customary conviction. "Good morning, Mr. Henderson," Hattie said. Her voice did not tremble. "Miss Miles," he grunted, nodding. "A loaf of bread, please, and a spool of white thread." She conducted her business with a calm she had never before possessed. She laid her items on the counter. Her hand was steady as she passed him the coins. She was aware of the silence in the store, of the customers pretending to examine goods while their eyes were fixed on her. She did not acknowledge them. She was simply a woman, buying her supplies. Just as Mr. Henderson was wrapping her loaf in brown paper, the bell above the door chimed. The store seemed to grow colder, the air thicker. Calder Boone stepped inside. He didn't look at her. He moved to the far end of the counter, near the barrels of nails and bolts, as if he had his own business to attend to. He was a mountain of a man in the cramped space, his presence changing the very atmosphere of the room. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. His arrival, just moments after hers, was the final, unspoken word. He was not holding her hand. He was not claiming her publicly. He was simply there, a quiet, unmovable fact, letting her lead, but making sure the whole world knew he was walking the same path. Hattie gathered her purchases. "Thank you, Mr. Henderson." She turned to leave, and as she did, her eyes met Calder's across the dusty, sunlit space. It was not a look of fiery passion or of storybook romance. It was something quieter, deeper, and infinitely more real. In his steady gray eyes, she saw an affirmation, a quiet pride, a promise that he would always be there, a silent guardian at her back. And in her gaze, he saw not a frightened girl, but a woman standing tall, her gratitude and a fragile, powerful trust shining back at him. It was a look that built a bridge across the dusty floorboards, a silent covenant understood by all who witnessed it. It was the beginning, not the end of a fairy tale, but the start of something far more precious, the belief that one could be worthy of love again, even when they thought they were broken beyond repair. She walked out of the store and into the bright morning sun. A moment later, he followed. They didn't touch, but as they walked down the street, their footsteps fell into a quiet, steady rhythm, perfectly in step, together. Thank you for listening to our story. We'd love to know where you're listening from. Please share your thoughts and where you are in the world in the comments below to connect with fellow fans. If you enjoyed this tale, please consider subscribing to our channel, Wild West Stories 1850, and give this video a like. Your support helps us immensely. And hitting that hype button ensures that this story can be heard by more people who love these timeless tales of the West.